Hi, I'm Chris Morash, and I want to say a few words about my book, Yeats on Theatre. I suppose for me, this book started back when I was a student, and I was reading books like Brecht on theatre, Artaud on theatre, Meyerhold on theatre, and somewhere along the way, I started reading what Yeats had written about theatre. And I began to find that I started thinking differently about theatre. And I'd have conversations with people at theatre, and I realized I was increasingly proceeding from quite different set of assumptions. And that began to make me think, well, look, it's time for a book called Yeats on Theatre. What I did really to start then was to kind of bring together all the materials that are out there that Yeats writes about theatre. And in some ways, this meant approaching Yeats in a different way than most people. Most people start with Yeats the poet, and they read Yeats the playwright, and then they treat the writings on theatre as something to explain the plays. I kind of did it the other way around. I started with Yeats's writings about theatre and treated them as what I believe they are, a coherent body of thinking about theatre that is profoundly original and one that we really need to pay attention to, and then work back to the plays. In many ways, the plays are Yeats working out the ideas that he has already worked out abstractly in the actual practice. They're like workshops. Now, this is a good time to do this because in the last 20 years or so, the kind of foundational scholarship on Yeats has reached a really impressive critical mass. There are published manuscripts for most of the plays. The letters have been collected and in many cases scrupulously annotated. A lot of this basic material has been brought together because Yeats never wrote one book about theatre. He wrote bits and pieces, some of it in periodicals, some of it in newspapers, some of it occasional essays. Sometimes he'd bring it together, sometimes as a preface for a play. He began to work as if he had written a sort of organum for the theatre, but never did. This is an attempt to bring all that together. And what is distinctive and what emerges from this, I think, is a playwright who takes seriously the idea of the unseen. Now let's remember, Yeats was also a practicing magician. He believed in spirits, he believed in an unseen world around us. And yet, he chooses to work in a medium, theatre, that is fundamentally physical. It involves bodies, it involves voices, it involves color, it involves sound, it involves light, it involves space. All are things that Yeats writes about in great detail. And he lays out not just a kind of theory of the theatre, but an aesthetics of the theatre, and develops a distinctive aesthetics of the theatre. And yet, at the end of the day, that aesthetics that he develops aims at producing the very thing that theatre can never be, the unseen. Now, I think that in some ways Yeats is much more our contemporary as a result of this than he belongs to his own time. One of the people who I started to really read when I was working on this book, who made me really think about the importance of Yeats, is the philosopher Alain Badiou, particularly when Badiou writes about what he calls thinking through theatre. That after so long trying to dismantle metaphysics, Badiou says we need to find a way to rethink metaphysics. And perhaps the way to do that is in a way that may seem counterintuitive, contradictory, even paradoxical. And that is to think metaphysics through the body, through the physical, through something that is irredeemably physical, theatre. And that's what I think Yeats is doing. And that's why I think when we start to understand the way Yeats thinks about theatre, he begins to appear as our contemporary. He begins to appear more post-dramatic than dramatic. So I wrote this book, not just for me and for theatre scholars, but also for theatre practitioners. The people I really want to read this book are the people who make theatre. Because what emerges when you read Yeats on theatre is a theatre maker who is passionately concerned with the great paradox of theatre, using the visible to produce the invisible.